Good afternoon. My name is Jane Campbell, and I have the honor of being the president and CEO of the United States Capitol Historical Society. Those of you who are regulars are not used to me being the starter of this, but we're doing this a little differently because today our speaker is Samuel Holliday, who many of you have heard as he opens and provides the technical support. Today, he's providing the scholarship support. So let me give you the technical reminders, which is that please put any content-based questions into the Q&A section, which is the one that looks like little speech bubbles, so that I can pull those questions and pose them to Sam when he finishes his talk. As always, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us. The United States Capitol Historical Society began this series of what we call lunch bites, which is focusing on the uniqueness of the Capitol as a symbol of democracy, as our temple of democracy, and talking about how the Capitol has really been a central place for this country over the years. And so over the course of now almost 2 years since the pandemic started, we have been highlighting the neighborhood the Capitol's involved in, fun stories like ghosts in the Capitol, bootleggers in the Capitol, but also serious stories about the work of the people in the Capitol. Today, we're going to talk about the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And this is the 100th anniversary of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. The unknown soldier did lay in state in the Capitol, and Sam is going to talk to you about that. And let me give you a little perspective on Sam. You see him as our organizer of this event, but let me give you a little bit of background about him. Sam has been a Washingtonian since childhood. He earned his Master's of Public Policy and a Bachelor of Arts in Public Policy from the College of William and Mary, joined the Society in June of 2016, and has held various positions serving as a tour guide, a speaker, communications professional, working with the retail, working with program management, and working with the basic administration of the organization. Before he came to the Historical Society, he worked for a trade association as a freelance fly-in scheduler, a title abstractor, and a commercial property manager. So Sam comes to us with a fascinating background and a real passion for history. And so it is my privilege to welcome you and to welcome our speaker today, Sam Holliday.
Well, Jane, thank you so much for that kind and warm introduction. And it's truly a joy to work for the Historical Society, to work with you and advance our mission to inspire informed patriotism, which is really, I think, a beautiful way of capturing what it is we do here. So as Jane said, I'm Sam Holliday, and as we get into today's discussion, I want to set the stage a little bit by first explaining why it is we're giving this talk. Of course, it's an important anniversary. It's the 100th anniversary of both the creation of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and the first interment with the World War I unknown. And there is a significant Capitol history, but there's also a little bit of personal society history that goes into how we've gotten involved in this commemoration, the Tomb Centennial. So as I start my program, many of you will recognize the person in the middle, David McCullough, the award-winning historian. This photo was taken when we gave him our Freedom Award in 2016, the Society's highest honor. And if some of you on the call are fortunate enough to know the other people pictured here, you'll know that there's some of the finest people to have walked the earth. On the left, you'll see Dorothy Dot Cosby, who is a great friend of the Society because, in part, her father, the late Congressman Fred Schwengel, founded our organization in 1962, 59 years ago this year. And on the right, you'll see her late husband, the wonderful Colonel Neil Cosby, who served for an extended period as treasurer of this organization. But more relatedly for today's conversation, Colonel Cosby served as part of the honor guard for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And if you look closely, I know it's difficult depending on what device you're using, but if you look closely, the pin he's wearing on his lapel is a representation of the Tomb Guard identification badge. It was a part of his identity that was important to him, and he helped found an organization focused on the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and the sentinels who guard it, the Society of the Honor Guard for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. We'll talk more about them in a little bit, but because we have this sort of society-family connection, this is particularly meaningful to talk about this history and to talk about the capital history of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So let me go ahead and there we go. So I want to take a step back and talk about how the Capitol plays a role in our understanding of public life, public mourning, and public memory. From some of the earliest designs for the Capitol building, there was this room you see pictured here, the crypt of the Capitol, designed to house the tomb for George Washington. Of course, many of you who've taken a Capitol tour or listened to some of our other webinars will know it is an empty tomb for George Washington, but from its earliest conception, this was a place of somber reflection on the lessons we can learn from George Washington. And I think it's an important way to understand the Capitol, as Jane mentioned, as our temple of democracy, that not only is this a place where we set the laws for ourselves, where we govern ourselves as a people, but it's also a place where we celebrate the best we have to offer and we mourn those we've lost. Congressional gold medals and laying in state ceremonies both take place in the Capitol Rotunda, just one floor above the room pictured here in this image. And so as we push forward, it's important to think that this is where our country comes together to, again, celebrate and to mourn those great figures we've lost. One of the ways, as I just mentioned, that we have paid tribute to leading figures and important people in our nation's history is through the lying in state ceremony. It's a somber occasion as part of an official state funeral in which the casket of the deceased is placed upon a catafalque, a support structure, which we'll talk a little bit more about farther along in today's program. And people, the public, are allowed to come in and pay their respects. You see, they drape the rotunda in black bunting. It's a very powerful and somber occasion. If you are ever in Washington for such an occasion, of course, we hope they are few and far removed, but it is, typically open to the public, and it's a really powerful way to participate in civics by paying tribute at a state funeral. Henry Clay was the first person to lay in state in 1852 when he passed away. This is a very rare honor bestowed on someone. Only 35 people in our nation's history have lain in state total through today, and only 10 had lain in state before the World War I unknown. Those were Henry Clay in 1852, Abraham Lincoln in 1865, Thaddeus Stevens in 1868, Charles Sumner in 1874, Vice President Henry Wilson in 1875, President James Garfield, this picture is actually from Garfield's laying in state ceremony in 1881, Senator John Logan in 1886, President William McKinley in 1901, Pierre L'Enfant, the designer for the city of Washington, laid in state when he was reinterred at Arlington National Cemetery. On his way to that reinterment, they paused so that he could receive state honors in the Capitol building. They felt it was that important as they were paying tribute to a figure who had for a brief time fallen into obscurity and was buried in a pauper's grave. And then relevant to World War I and this commemoration, Admiral of the Navy George Dewey was laid in state in 1917 before we get to the World War I unknown in 1921. Congress also has played a role in supporting the memory and the preservation of and the tribute to those who have made the ultimate sacrifice, the last full measure of devotion in service of our country. In 1862, Congress passed the Omnibus Act, which included a provision here you can see from the National Archives, an image of it and a transcription, and it provided the president with the authority to acquire land and create national cemeteries for those who gave that last full measure of devotion, for those who died in service of their country. And ever since, the Congress has been involved in preserving the memory and supporting those families who have lost loved ones in wars. Now, as we push forward, we start to talk about different conflicts after the Civil War. I should mention before we get into that, there are actually a significant number of unknowns buried at Arlington from the Civil War. It's believed more than 2,000 remains in a large memorial. And we can get into that a little bit later, but you get to the Spanish-American War that was fought in farther flung locations than the Civil War, or the Mexican-American War, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. And you have a policy enacted of repatriation, bringing back the remains of deceased service members who died fighting in that Spanish-American War, bringing them back to the continental United States to be buried closer to home. That conflict did not last quite as long, and it had significantly fewer casualties than the First World War, which plays into some of the decision-making about how to deal with repatriation and how the importance, I should say, of a tomb of the unknown soldier. Before we get to that, though, I will mention that in 1913, Congress approved and authorized spending for the government to create a new memorial amphitheater at Arlington National Cemetery. At this point, the cemetery had been in use since the Civil War, and they recognized the need for a larger and more somber space to accommodate the visitors who were there to pay tribute to their deceased loved ones. And so they appropriated the funds, they authorized the spending to create this new amphitheater, and really made this investment in Arlington National Cemetery as the nation's premier cemetery, the nation's premier place to pay this special tribute. Now, after the First World War, you have a congressman from New York, Representative Hamilton Fish III. The Fish family was very prominent in New York politics, going back to the Stuyvesant family in the colonial era. His father was a Secretary of State. His grandfather was an adjutant general and fought in the adjutant general of New York and fought in the Revolution. And so here he is. He's fought in the First World War. He was highly decorated, won the Silver Star for valor, retired out as a major from the U.S. Army. He's pictured here on the left in his uniform with one of the lieutenant generals who commanded him during the war. And then he won election as a Republican from New York to Congress and served there for 25 years. And Hamilton Fish really was the driving force for the creation of a tomb of the unknown soldier. He authored the legislation, and he was its major advocate on Capitol Hill. This concept of a tomb for the unknown soldier was one that was put to good use and was demonstrated by France and the United Kingdom after the First World War. This was a tremendously costly war. This was a devastating war in terms of casualties, in terms of loved ones lost, and there were significant concerns at the conclusion of the war that retrieval of remains from some of these battlefields could be fraught with peril. There were potentially unexploded ordnance. Some of the chemical weapons used during the First World War posed significant risks. And so France and the United Kingdom actually had to restrict and chose to restrict how many of their soldiers lost during the war could be brought back to cemeteries at home. And so those countries both opted to pursue the creation of a tomb for the unknown soldier in their respective capitals. At Westminster Abbey in London and at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris were interred with great solemnity and great purpose unknown soldiers, so that the people of those respective countries, the United Kingdom and France, could have a place to go and pay tribute to the ones they could not bring home to their family. And it really served as both a civic tribute and a very personal tribute for those who went to pay their respects. And so Hamilton Fish had seen the success, the importance of this sort of a memorial. And while the US was still undertaking repatriation, there were a great number of unknowns that resulted from the First World War. And so he, again, authored the legislation to create this Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. and place it at Arlington National Cemetery here just across the river from our capital city as a monument for the nation to mourn those lost, whether they came home or not. So, as I mentioned, there were a great number of unknown soldiers who had perished by the end of the First World War, and the selection process was actually really rather fascinating. I should mention that they gathered from several different major battlefields, different unknown soldiers who had fallen in battle, and they brought them to a small town in the Champagne region of France, where one of the highest decorated enlisted soldiers, enlisted veterans of the war, made the final selection of the anonymous flag-draped coffins to be the unknown soldier to rest at Arlington in eternal memory and glory. As a symbol, as a tangible representation of all of those other unknowns and all of those others who were interred across an ocean from their families and loved ones. Now, this image you see here is the unknown soldier of World War I being brought ashore at the Navy Yard here in Southeast Washington, D.C., and he's brought to shore from the USS Olympia, which had seen significant battle and performed valiantly during the course of the First World War. And the voyage back from France was hardly a smooth passage. In fact, as they rode through, as they sailed through a tempest, there are reports that the swells and the rain and the winds were so strong that the Marines guarding the casket, which had been lashed to the deck of the Olympia, were given the option to retreat below decks, and they refused, instead lashing themselves to the deck so they could maintain their watch through these challenging circumstances and pay this high honor, this high tribute to an unknown soldier, representative of so many others who had given that last full measure of devotion. It reached the Navy Yard, and then it proceeded up to the Capitol building. As we've been discussing, the lying in state ceremony is a somber and high honor to be paid to someone. This image was from the laying in state of the unknown from World War I. And what you can see here, we mentioned it briefly, the catafalque, I'll use my cursor to highlight it here, the catafalque upon which the World War I unknown rests in this image is the same one that was constructed and used for Abraham Lincoln. In fact, every lying in state ceremony since Abraham Lincoln's has used the Lincoln catafalque, which remains in the possession of the architect of the Capitol, our fine partners across the street, and they preserve it and they display it. When the visitor center reopens, it's on display in their exhibition hall until it's needed, in which case they remove it and they make sure it's ready for further service to our country in supporting those who are paying tribute to. So they have the laying in state ceremony, and then they proceed for the interment on November 11th, 1921. They draw the casket on a caisson by horseback, and they take it over. They have the state funeral ceremony in that newly constructed amphitheater, which had been recently completed. At this point, it is presided over by then President Warren G. Harding, and the interment is made on just the other side of the amphitheater here in this newly created tomb for the unknown soldier. You can see this is just a small snapshot of the thousands upon thousands of Americans who came to pay tribute. Again, this one person representing so many more, and the channel through which they could participate in public mourning and public memory. Now, Congress's involvement in the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and in how we pay tribute to those we've lost did not end with the First World War and the interment of the first unknown. In 1926, the Congress appropriated the funds and authorized the spending to increase and improve the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, to enhance the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier by adding this large monument on top. If you look, I'll jump back briefly, this initial tomb for the unknown soldier was actually at grade. It was at the same level as the plaza that surrounded it. And then they added this sarcophagus-like structure above with the figure of valor and the immortal words here in this grave. You know what? I'm going to consult my notes later and I'll give you the quote. I don't want to butcher it because it is a beautiful and powerful sentiment, but you have this structure added on top of the existing tomb to create that much more prominent of a space and that much more somber of a space to remind people that this is a place of great solemnity. Now, I should mention as well, of course, we all know there were conflicts after the First World War, hence the name the First World War. And after the conclusion of the Second World War, the Congress passed what is now Public Law 79-429, authorizing the interment of a World War II unknown soldier at the Tomb of the Unknowns. And they were in the process of preparing the selection and preparing the transport back to the United States, the repatriation for internment, when the Korean War broke out, and they suspended that operation. After the Korean War concluded, Congress passed a new law, Public Law 84-975, which authorized the selection and internment of a Korean War unknown soldier in and around the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. And so they continued to view this as a way for the nation to pay tribute, again, to all of those lost, whether they were repatriated or not, and a place where the country could come together. Here is the lying in state ceremony for both the World War II and Korean War unknown soldiers in the Capitol building. And you'll note that they are side by side in the rotunda. And as we briefly mentioned, every lying in state ceremony has used the Lincoln catafalque, which you can see in greater detail here. This is the Lincoln catafalque pictured, but what the Congress and the Capitol institutions decided to do to facilitate this dual ceremony, this joint ceremony of high honor, was to create a replica, an exact replica second catafalque that could be used when multiple caskets are needed. And so side by side, you had the Lincoln catafalque and the second catafalque, and they actually, during the course of the laying in state, rotated the caskets of the World War II and Korean War unknowns, so that at some point during the ceremony, both rested on the Lincoln catafalque as part of this great tribute. They were then carried with great honor and somber spirit to Arlington National Cemetery for interment in front of farther along the plaza from the main sarcophagus that we were showing you a moment ago. Now, after the conclusion of the Vietnam War, Congress passed in 1973 Public Law 93-43, which authorized the selection of and internment of an unknown soldier from the Vietnam War. There was actually at this point some skepticism that that there would be unknowns as we had advanced identifying technology as dog tags, which had been introduced by the First World War, but they had been made more reliable and were more reliably used to identify remains, whether there would be an unknown. But by the 1980s, an unknown soldier had been identified, or had been selected. That comes up later, though, in just a moment. And a brief note, Hamilton Fish IV, son of Hamilton Fish III, who we spoke about earlier, Hamilton Fish IV actually introduced a resolution in Congress. He was then himself a Republican congressman from New York. Earlier in that same Congress, he introduced a resolution to select and inter an unknown soldier from the Vietnam War at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, but his resolution got folded into the larger package, which was passed later in that same Congress. Now, I mentioned a little bit, got a little bit ahead of myself there, slip of the tongue, that the unknown soldier from Vietnam was actually successfully identified. And so there was some thought as people were working through the challenges of prisoners of war and missing in action following the Vietnam War, the family of Air Force First Lieutenant Michael Blasey came to believe that he might have been the Vietnam War unknown. And so the Department of Defense agreed to exhume the Vietnam War unknown soldier and to conduct DNA testing, which confirmed that, in fact, the Vietnam War unknown was Lieutenant Michael Blasey. And so at the request of his family, his remains were moved closer to home to the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. That happened in 1998. And then in 1999, on September 17th, which was both Constitution Day and, more importantly for this purpose, Prisoner of War Missing in Action Recognition Day, the Department of Defense redesignated the Vietnam War tomb at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier for all those missing service members who never made it home. And so it stands in a similar way to the crypt for George Washington as a permanent tribute to those lost, even though there's no one interred directly beneath that stone. And so as we get to a point here, I want to mention that, we are part of a bigger quilt of recognitions and commemorations, a bigger coalition of commemorations, I should say, of this important centennial. The organizing entity is this Society of the Honor Guard for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, founded in part by the late, great Neil Cosby. And they have done some fantastic work organizing commemorations. They've done some really wonderful research. Their website, tombguard.org, has a really great, concise, and important history of the tomb and the tomb guard. A lot of frequently asked questions, and we can work on some of those as people start to submit questions. The president of that organization, Gavin McIlvenna, is a wonderful fellow and has been very helpful as we've participated and tried to help as they organize this commemoration. Justin J.D. Ortman helped with some of the research, as did one of our history interns, Ethan Fine. So thus concludes my brief overview of the history of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, a legislative history, a congressional history. And now I would welcome any questions you may have. Let me go ahead and stop the screen share, and Jane will start posing that.
Well, here we go. Sam, as our folks are wont to do, one of our listeners found the quote. The quote states on the tomb, "Here rest in honored glory, an American soldier known but to God." So thank you, James Livingston, for that.
Thank you.
Now we have a question. Do the unknown soldier remains from the various wars, do they lie together, or are they replaced when there's one from a new war? What happens with
Sure, that's an excellent question. And it makes me realize I should have included a diagram or an aerial view to help illustrate this. I might be able to point it out on one of the photos I included in the presentation, but they are not on top of each, they're not all in the same plot, if that makes sense. They are, there's the World War I unknown, and then to the east, make sure I get my geography right here, beside the tomb for the World War I unknown, below grade, so at below ground level for that plaza, are the World War II and Korean War unknowns, and the empty vault for the Vietnam unknown. So they are separated, but they're in the same vicinity as the big sarcophagus that everyone's familiar with. So they are all there, and they're all guarded by the sentinels. The mat is between the below ground vaults for the World War II and Korean War unknowns and the gallery, the public gallery, for where people can pay their respects when they visit Arlington National Cemetery.
So here's an interesting question. I gotta love our listeners. They have such creative questions.
Absolutely.
So do you have any information about why catafalque was used instead of beer, or
sure, yeah, that is
it, because catafalque has sort of religious overtones, while beer is more secular as a term.
Absolutely, and that is one something I've learned over my years working in scholarship for the U.S. Capitol Historical Society is that there are frequently these incredible questions from our audience that I have to just say I actually don't know the answer to that, but it's a fascinating one. I imagine I will. We're going to be careful here because we're a historical society. We want to make sure we give you as accurate information as possible. I imagine the term was selected during Lincoln's laying in state and Lincoln's state funeral process's commemoration, and that because everyone has used his since, the term that was selected stuck, even when they created a second one, especially when they created a second one, exact replica. Now, again, I don't know the reason that that term was selected at the time, but that is an excellent question. Gosh, you gotta love our audience. They're
I tell you, I love our audience. You never know.
right. Absolutely.
And give us time. We're going to hear somebody type in
I'm sure.
the answer. But here's a question. Do you know the selection process for choosing an unknown soldier? Like, how did they determine that the soldier is totally unknown? I mean, presumably they check the dog tags, the infantry register, they
Sure.
interview family. I mean, how did that come to be?
Sure. Well, so that is a great question, and I'm glad I printed out some of my research notes here because I can give you guys an exact answer in just a moment. But I can tell you the initial part of the question, whether someone was truly unknown, had to just sort of be assumed that if they couldn't identify the remains of a fallen soldier on the battlefield, they were oftentimes buried in large, not quite mass graves, but they were buried as unknown soldiers. And there were many of them. There were the number I mentioned earlier. Just at Arlington, there are over 2,000 unknowns from the Civil War, and that by the time you get to the First World War, there were, again, I think the number Hamilton Fish mentioned at one point was more than 1,700 unknown deceased from American service members fighting in the First World War. So in terms of whether they were unidentified or unknown, was really, it was pretty much whether they could determine when they fell in battle, who they were. And that's where the technology of our time has really, or the evolution of technology for identification has really improved the way we can pay tribute more specifically. We can, identify people. Like I said, the Vietnam unknown was identified through DNA technology, which at this point has meant most, again, we hope it's none, but it's enabled us to at least identify those who give that last full measure of devotion. And then in terms of the actual selection, I can tell you that for the World War I unknown, like I said, they gathered unknown military personnel from different military cemeteries that had been set up, quickly in France. And they brought them to, and I apologize to any French-speaking Francophone listeners here, Chalon-sur-Marne in the Champagne region of France, where they prepared the city hall of the town for the selection. On October 24th, 1921, Major Robert P. Harbold of the Quartermaster Corps, aided by French and American soldiers, rearranged the caskets so that each rested on a shipping case other than the one in which it had arrived. Now, this is from, I should also mention, Arlington National Cemetery has prepared some wonderful resources for the centennial of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier as well. Their website is arlingtoncemetery.mil. And it's a wealth of information if this is a topic of importance and interest to you. But so they rearranged them so that the selector could not determine which battlefield the soldier on which battlefield the soldier had fallen for each of the 4 unknowns gathered. And then Edward Younger, who had served in the 2nd Battalion, 5th Headquarters Company, 2nd Battalion, 50th Infantry, American forces in Germany, and had received high military honors, was called upon to select the final unknown to make the voyage to Washington. And he did so by placing a bouquet of white roses on one of the 4 caskets. And that a similar ceremony took place for the World War II unknown. It was actually, not to get too far off topic for the question, but World War II was such a global war that there was a significant logistical effort to make sure that this unknown soldier could represent all the unknown soldiers, whether they were in Europe, in Northern Africa, in the Pacific, and so they actually carried out a similar process where they gathered a group of unknowns from each theater and made an anonymous selection. And then they kind of kept repeating the process until finally one unknown each from the European theater and the Pacific theater, or the Atlantic theater and the Pacific theater, were placed on board a naval vessel just off the coast of Virginia, and they were anonymized. Once they were on the boat, the selector didn't know which was from which theater, and he placed a bouquet of red and white roses on the ultimate selection for the Second World War. So it's always a really fascinating and also a very somber process that they went through. For the First World War, the Second World War, and the Korean War, likewise, they had a similar type process in place. So that's a bit about the selection, but that's a great question as well. And I think I saw, not to jump ahead of you, Jane, but I think I saw some of our listeners have put into the chat area some of the answers about beer versus catafalque. So I know they just sent it to us, but I'll ask that perhaps that listener, Donna, if you can put that into the chat for everyone, I think that would be a helpful tool for people as we continue this discussion. By the way, there's a quote I meant to mention earlier before we jump to the next questions. When introducing the legislation for the World War I, the original Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, Hamilton Fish had a really beautiful explanation for why he thought this was important. He said the purpose of the legislation was, quote, to bring home the body of an unknown American warrior who in himself represents no section, creed, or race in the late war, and who typifies, moreover, the soul of America and the supreme sacrifice of her heroic dead. So, as we talk about public memory and public mourning, that was at the heart of the legislation that Hamilton Fish introduced.
So, Sam, now that we have much more sophisticated identification process, there is no unknown soldier beyond the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War is actually an empty vessel. Is that?
That's correct. That is correct, and it's likely to remain the case. Again, you hope it's none that fall. You hope it's none that fall in service of our country. But it's some small solace that DNA technology and identifying technology has reached a point where we can identify those who give that last full measure of devotion, so their families have some closure, so they can be repatriated or interred in name, and that their families have a place to their families have a place to pay tribute in a very personal way, instead of the Tomb of the Unknown is a beautiful memorial and an important way that anyone who lost someone could go pay tribute through the channel of the unknown. But I think it's reasonable to say that being able to identify people so that they can have a more personal tribute is better. So it's really we're fortunate, and I think something to be said for the ability of more rapid medical care. They can do incredible things with battlefield medicine in the 21st century that just were not available in those earlier conflicts. So it's through a combination of factors, I think it's thought to be nearly certain that there won't be a future unknown. We can certainly hope that that's the case.
So, Sam, one of the queries is, how can we be certain that the unknown soldier is truly a fallen American and not an enemy or an American ally?
That is an excellent question. And I think a lot of that has to do with how they were initially, how they would have initially been identified as an American soldier or an enemy soldier, but not necessarily been identified as an individual person. And so, again, this is one of those areas where I can draw some inference. I don't have a definitive answer necessarily on on the specific unknowns, but it seems reasonable that when they were initially interred, because all of these unknowns, they weren't taken straight from the battlefield to Washington. They were interred as unknown soldiers, amidst American cemeteries in these foreign theaters. And it harkens back to our recent conversation with Connie Morella when she served on the Battle Monuments Commission, these overseas cemeteries for American service members killed in battle. And so again, with the careful lens of inference, I can say that it's likely they were able to tell pretty readily whether someone was an American service member or an enemy service member in these conflicts when they were initially interred closer to the battlefield. But that is an excellent question, and it actually brings up an interesting point that tomb and memorial I mentioned about the Civil War unknowns at Arlington is a mix of Union and Confederate unknowns that they had difficulty to that point. They had difficulty identifying by the time they moved them to Arlington because they had been in other parts of the cemetery or other parts of the area that they had difficulty identifying at that point when they were reinterred whether they had been Confederate or Union. And so the Civil War unknown tomb at Arlington is a mix, and it's an acknowledged mix in the documentation.
So tell us, was there any opposition? I mean, this is Congress, there's always controversy. Was there any opposition to the creation of the?
Sure, there are some things that seem certain in this life, and friction in Congress seems to be one of them. But to the best of my recollection from the research, this was pretty widely held. And through all four of the initial interments, there was pretty bipartisan, pretty wide support for this sort of a memorial. This was, put it this way, I don't think it was an uphill battle for Congressman Fish in the 19 teens and the 1920s. So, and we're seeing a couple of points. Sorry to jump back over, but we're seeing from a couple of folks in the chat section, similar to the point that the uniform they're wearing or where they were buried can help draw the solid thinking that these are in fact American service members, that those initial sort of triage identifications that this is an American service member put them into an American cemetery, but they weren't able to identify the person. So thank you to the couple of folks in the chat section. But anyway, I know we have some more questions here.
A couple more questions.
Sure.
Someone asked about the recording, and everyone who is registered will get an email that will give you a link to the recording. So if you want to share this with your friends and neighbors, be happy to do that. You should know, Sam, that a former tomb guard who served from 99 to 2001 wanted to say a special thanks because it was a precious time in his life.
God love you. Thank you for your service. And, it's really, I feel, and I imagine I can speak on behalf of the society for this, that it's been an honor for us to play a small part in this commemoration, that, this is an important anniversary. And, like we were talking about, our mission is to inspire informed patriotism. And part of that is recognizing the sacrifices that have enabled us to have this constitutional democracy, and that telling the story of the temple of democracy, the United States Capitol, is a story of sacrifices made for future generations, sacrifices made for the preservation of our democracy. So it's been an honor working on this one. Absolutely.
So Sam, someone asked a question. You showed a picture of the monument itself. How was the monument chosen? How was the sculptor chosen? What's the history of the monument and the gathering area around the Tomb of the Unknown?
So here, let's see what I have in my notes. Let's see here. So the tomb, let me see if I'll pull up while I pull this back up for a moment. So I believe the question is about the actual sort of sarcophagus monument. And I know the figures facing towards us in this image represent valor. There are 6 wreaths representing, for the World War I unknown, 6 of the major battlefields, of the First World War. And then there's that quote facing towards, let me see if I can use my cursor here, facing towards the amphitheater and the sentinel guarding the tomb, that beautiful quote that one of our listeners was able to write into us, because again, it's too good a quote to get it wrong. So it's let me see here, make sure I have any other more specific information to give to you guys about the tomb. So yeah, so that's the quick brief on that. And again, the Society for the Honor Guard, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and Arlington National Cemetery both have put together some really outstanding resources to talk about this, to talk about the anniversary, to talk about the history of the tomb. And it was carved, I can tell you this, I do know that the memorial was carved by the Piccirilli, and again, so I'm now apologizing to any Italian speakers on the call today. But the brothers who did some of the carving work at the Lincoln Memorial and elsewhere in Monumental, Washington, they worked on the sarcophagus-like monument for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So it's steeped in Washington, D.C. history as well.
And Sam, one of the other things I think we maybe should talk about as we come to the end of our time together is when Gavin first approached us, one of the things he was very interested in was encouraging people to celebrate the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in their own communities on this Veterans Day coming up in November. Because while there is not a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in every community, there are people who served in the military and people who lost loved ones across the nation. And so that is one thing that the Tomb Guard Society has a set of resources that we can include in the follow-up information with ideas about how to celebrate. They want to have bells, everybody go do bells at 11 o'clock, and including you can do it on your phone, everybody. The amazing thing is now you don't need a church bell to have a bell. You can have church bells on your phone, and a variety of, they really wanted to see the creativity of the American spirit as we move forward. And now I'm going to pull a question that came out of the chat. Okay, go ahead.
was going to say, if I may, to that point, they have a whole list of centennial projects that they're promoting. They're working with people to plant never forget gardens with a representation of the tomb guard badge, and that here lies an honored glory, an American soldier known but to God, a tribute that we may never forget those who we may never forget those who made that ultimate sacrifice. They, like you said, they're working on the National Salute Project. And so all of that is on, to your point, it's on the tombguard.org website that we'll share in the follow-up. But you said you had another question. Let's
just a couple of things, as people are sort of posting in both the chat and the Q&A. One of the things in the chat is that 41 members of the Tomb Guard Society will be going to France on October 18th to be part of France's recreation of the World War I selection. And the question that came through is the British Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is very important in its national life, but is not really visited much by foreign dignitaries, whereas our Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is often visited by foreign dignitaries. Do you have any insight into how the tomb has become such a big part of global diplomacy?
That is a fascinating question. And this is one of those other areas where, being a careful historian, I will say I don't have a specific answer to it. I can infer that the British Tomb of the Unknown, the British Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is in Westminster Abbey, which is of course still functional space for other purposes, and of course ours is here at Arlington National Cemetery, which is more of a public. It's the whole purpose of Arlington National Cemetery is paying tribute to those who have made the ultimate sacrifice for our nation. But in terms of how ours has become such a force for global diplomacy, that's a really fascinating question. It's a geopolitical question. It's a foreign policy question. But you're absolutely, the question is absolutely accurate in pointing out that it is, you can go, the Arlington National Cemetery has a photo page that you can find galleries and albums of images going back a dozen years of every world leader that's come to visit Washington that laid a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And perhaps part of the answer is that we have a process available for these world leaders to pay tribute, and perhaps part of it as well is that during that first interment of the World War I unknown, the unknown from World War I was decorated by a great number of the Allied nations. They sent dignitaries to award some of their military's highest honors to the World War I unknown as part of the service. And so perhaps, again, a little bit of inference, but perhaps part of the impact, the importance of our Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is that there was already some global interest in appreciation of and respect for what we were doing here with ours, with our World War I unknown. And thank you. I will mention we got a brief correction that the Never Forget Garden plaque is the east relief of the tomb, not the Tomb Guard badge. For anyone who's looking to plant their own Never Forget Garden, you can find more information about that on that tombguard.org website.
And the other thing, several people, have been sort of commenting that it also may be that the United States played a critical role in finalizing both of the world wars, which then created the United States as a world military power. Therefore, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is a component of that. And many European nations and beyond have their own Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. The Soviets have a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, but this is ours, and we're talking about ours. We also have to love James Livingston, who pointed out that the tomb is made up of 7 pieces. The marble is from white Yule from Colorado. And the sculptor was Thomas Hudson Jones, and then the architect as Lorimer Rich. So we are very interested in our, folks who really have great resources. Sam, we're just about at the close of our time. And so would you like to kind of give people a charge? As we move forward, we would like to see people not just listen to this and say, isn't that interesting? But this is one where we'd like you to take action. We'd like you to find a way in your own community to plant a garden, to do a commemoration. This is 100 years of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and it's just one way that we recognize the people who served in the military and the families whose loved ones served in the military in the past and even today. So Sam, give us our charge as we move forward.
Absolutely. Well, that's really, that's really well put, Jane. And I think, what I would say is, our role, as I mentioned earlier, is inspiring informed patriotism and civic engagement. And part of civic engagement, there are a lot of ways that people engage in our democracy. It's a participatory sport, our democracy. And a lot of that is voting, a lot of that is advocacy. But an important piece of it that always needs to be present is respect and appreciation for the sacrifices that have been made to give us this system. Here we are in 2021, and we have this absolute privilege to live and exist and work and support this democracy. And that we have that because people have made the ultimate sacrifice time and time again to give it to us these many generations on. And so I think, our charge to ourselves, our charge to those of you who are kind enough to spend some time with us today is, sometime as we build up to this 100th anniversary of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, think about how civic engagement, how participating in our democracy can be lived out in a way that pays some tribute here to those sacrifices made. It's incredibly important. It's part of our duty, part of our obligation as citizens to be part of, making sure that these sacrifices are not forgotten and that we live up to the promise of our democracy. We haven't always, as a nation, we haven't always lived up to the promise of our founding, to the promise of our identity, but we always strive to do so. And part of that is making that commitment to pay tribute, making that commitment to remember and to, appreciate. So that's,
well, thank you, Sam. Thank you for your words, your research, your scholarship. We appreciate seeing you in a different role today. And we thank all of you for joining us. As you look ahead, we will be starting our symposium in October and looking at the Gilded Age. And each time we do a symposium, we have historians come and try to put some perspective on what's gone on in the past with a little bit of a look to what does this mean for us as we move forward in the future. As always, I point out to you that the United States Capitol Historical Society lives and breathes on the contributions of members and supporters. So thank you very much for your support. We are very grateful as you start thinking about, what you want to do for Giving Tuesday. Think of the Capitol Historical Society as part of your charitable giving. Thank you for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again in October. Thank you, Sam. You did a great presentation. We really look forward to working with you again. Be well. Goodbye.
thank you, everyone.